Okay, good evening everyone, and welcome back to the 2023-2024 Institute for Northern Studies Public Seminar Series. My name's Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at INS, and it's my great pleasure to be chairing these seminars. Now, before I introduce tonight's speaker, I have my customary housekeeping announcements that I always have to make. The first is, and I apologise for everyone that tunes into all of these seminars, you'll have heard this about a million times. But as always, my first announcement is that tonight's session is, of course, being recorded, and the recording will be available to watch on the INS YouTube channel, so you can relive the whole thing anytime at your leisure. The second point I just need to make is that we will be having a Q&A session after the paper tonight, and you're welcome to submit questions at any point. Perhaps you might want to keep them to the end after the paper. And what we'll do is we'll collect all of them via the chat function on your screen, and I will put them to our speaker. And when you send them in via the chat function, just make sure that you address them to all panelists, and it just ensures that none of the questions fall through the gaps. And the third and final bit of housekeeping that I have to do before we proceed is I have a little bit of shameless self-promotion for INS's upcoming summer course at UHI Perth called Rulers and Raiders, Celts and Vikings in Central Scotland. This will be a residential course from the 17th to the 22nd of June, where participants will take part in excursions, lectures and workshops from Viking experts within the department, including our very good speaker tonight. And it will, I am reliably informed, include a ceilidh. So if you're looking for an opportunity to escape into the early medieval period, please email ins@uhi.ac.uk for inquiries and all booking details. Now, to the main event. Sticking with the Viking theme, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Shane McLeod. Shane completed his PhD on the Great Viking Army in 2011 at the University of Western Australia, which he then turned into a monograph in 2014. Since then, he has been a research fellow at the University of Stirling and has published over 20 works on Viking society, culture, migration, and military organisation. We're lucky here at INS to have Shane as part of our team, and he joined us in 2022. He's currently working on the Norse in the Sea project with Professor Alex Sandmark and several others, but for his paper tonight, he's going to be returning to his roots to discuss with us Kings on the Move, the case of the Great Viking Army. A very warm welcome, Shane.
Thank you, and can everyone, can you see that opening slide fine? Excellent. Thank you for the kind words. Before we start, as I was putting this together, I suddenly realized that there are a limited number of images for the Great Viking Army available. And I know that a presentation full of slides with only text gets very dull very quickly. So I have resorted to using later medieval images like the one on the screen now. So for anyone who doesn't know, the armour, weapons and ships in this image are not very accurate for the Viking Great Army. However, killing of people and burning of houses in the background probably is quite accurate. So yeah, there'll be no more than 4 slides in a row of just text. So hopefully you'll all manage to stay with me and it won't get too tedious with lots of reading. Also, all of the images that I show should be credited, like this one is at the top of the screen. The only exception are a couple of photographs that I took, so I didn't bother crediting myself. So tonight's talk is largely based on the paper on the screen there, which is coming out later this year in a volume, which I'm sure will be fantastic. It's certainly a really interesting topic. And as with any research that's not based on a new excavation or a newly discovered text, I'm very much looking at previously done work and building on that and looking at the work through the lens of kingship, which is something a little bit different, I hope. So yeah, during the slides, if I quote anyone, I have hopefully provided a quick reference to where that came from, and then there's also a general reference list for the ones that weren't mentioned on the slides during the talk at the very end. So anyone wanting to follow anything up, hopefully I have covered it. And obviously there's many more references in the actual chapter in that volume than I can put in a PowerPoint. All right, just in case there are anyone that's not really familiar with the Great Army, I thought I'd provide a quick overview. So here are the highlights, really. They arrived in East Anglia in 865. We don't get told where they came from, but they probably came from various places, met up in East Anglia in order to form the Great Army. The following year, they captured York, and a few months after that, the Northumbrian kings mounted a counterattack trying to retake York, and they failed and they both died. So yeah, the Great Army are basically in control of York and at least southern Northumbria from late 866. They killed the East Anglian king and took that kingdom in 869/870. The Mercian king was either exiled or forced to flee in 874. So, yep, quite successful. At this point, the army seems to split into two groups. There were various attempts to conquer Wessex, but they never quite succeeded. The closest they got was probably in 878 before Alfred had a kind of a rousing victory at Edington and forced the Scandinavian king to surrender and get baptized, etc. And as you can see, the kingdoms that they did conquer, they eventually settled in. So one thing to note there is that the Great Army is in operation, basically on campaign, for over a decade, which is really quite a remarkable feat. And just having a quick look at this great image from Haywood's Historical Atlas of the Vikings, as you can see, they were very busy. They got around a lot. And there's probably more going on than what this image shows, because this is based on our primary sources, and the primary sources are very biased towards Wessex. So when I speak about Wessex, I'm talking about southern England that you can see there. So yeah, we have lots of information about what's happening in Wessex and not so much for the other kingdoms. And as well as being very busy, they were very successful over a long period of time, which suggests that they were well organized, which in turn suggests that there was strong leadership, which is what I'm focusing on tonight. And the other reason that they were so successful is that they were probably very large. All of the great work that's happened on Viking winter camps over the last decade or so has really, I think, put to bed the whole debate over whether it was a big army or a small army. So we are talking about a group numbering in thousands rather than hundreds, although it should be stressed that some of those thousands would be non-combatants, so it's not all people who are fighting. All right, so I'm going to start with the primary sources. And the Anglo-Saxon, the F recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that it was Ivar and Ubba who killed King Edmund or St. Edmund of East Anglia. And that is slightly iffy because we're not sure. The F recension is quite late, so we're not sure if this information comes from the original chronicle or if it is later information that they've added in. So possible mention of two great army leaders there. And as I promised, images from later medieval texts. This one's not as late, so at least the clothing and everything's looking a bit better. This is the 12th century version of the earlier Passion of St Edmund, and this is showing the members of the Great Army killing St Edmund. And as you can see, it's written around 986, and Abbo is getting his information both from the monks of Bury St Edmund, who presumably there are traditions around St Edmund at that foundation, but also from the Archbishop of Canterbury, who supposedly got his information from someone who was actually with St Edmund during the events that Abbo talks about. Despite that, there is some, obvious fantastical features, like in lots of saints' lives. So, for example, on the screen there, after being shot full of arrows, Edmund is beheaded, and the Great Army throw his head away. Later on, after they've left and and the Anglo-Saxons come back wanting to bury St Edmund, the head starts, I think the head yells out, or a wolf growls, or something miraculous happens, and they find his head so they can bury him whole. So there are these fantastical elements, but at the same time, there are snippets of information which could actually be genuine because they sound quite plausible, and I'll be discussing one of those a little bit later. So moving back to the primary sources, the earliest version of the chronicle that survives is Chronicle A, and all of those mentions there are coming from that. And Asser also was using a version of the chronicle when he wrote his Life of St Alfred. So they're our two main primary sources. And you can see that there are various mentions of kings. Sometimes they are specifically called kings, and other times we're just given the names of leaders. So first off, in 871, we get the heathen kings Halfdan and Bagseg. Then in 8745, Halfdan and his part of the army, this is when they split, go up to the River Tyne and then raid further north into Scotland. Meanwhile, the other part of the army have three kings who haven't been mentioned previously, so we don't know if they were around and got promoted to being kings or if they were more recent arrivals. Then in 8756, so a year after, we're told that Halfdan settles with his part of the army around in Northumbria, which mostly seems to mean around York. A couple of years later, you've got King Guthrum invading Wessex and then submitting later to Alfred. So the other two kings that were with Guthrum in Cambridge, they've disappeared. So we don't know if they've just left England or if they've been killed. There's no mention of them. So in 878, a really interesting mention is that a brother of Ivar and Halfdan lands in Devon. And although the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle A never names Ivar as being a leader of the Great Army, they were presumably aware of who Ivar was because they say that it's a brother of Ivar. So that's, yes, rather interesting. And finally, in 890, you get a notice of the death of Guthrum, a northern king who dies, who's been king of East Anglia at that point for a bit over a decade. So that's all the mentions of named leaders and when they get called kings in our primary sources. Now, the terminology is really interesting because they are using the same Old English word, kinning, for leaders of the Great Army as they use for Anglo-Saxon kings like Alfred. So they're not drawing any kind of distinction between the leaders of the Great Army and the King of Wessex or the King of Mercia. So that is probably quite significant. And there's that famous Heathen Kings quote again from 871. Also in 871, we get quite detailed descriptions of some of the battles, and they also refer to earls, or what in Old Norse would be jarls, for leaders who are a bit below the rank of king. So they're kind of drawing distinctions between the leadership of the great army. And this leads credence to the idea of the army being made up of liðs, as discussed by Richard Abels and Ben Raffield and various other people. So these liðs are like smaller military groups, maybe 50 people, maybe 100, each with their own commander. So maybe those commanders are the jarls, but then you still got kings who seem to be in control of the overall army. We also get a bit more information in later sources that are using earlier materials. So Athelwerd, writing in the 10th century, he uses an early version of the Chronicle that unfortunately no longer exists. And he also names Ivar as being the king when the army arrived in 865, and Ivar again with Ubba killing St Edmund in 870. And it has been argued by some scholars that the way he spells Ivar, which is different to other sources, means that he might actually be drawing on a genuine 9th century text for that information. Further north, the history of St Cuthbert, which was produced at Chester Street in Northumberland. That's interesting because it distinguishes between Halfdan the king and Ubba the duke. So a bit like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, talking about kings and jarls. In the history of St Cuthbert, which is in Latin, it's talking about king and duke. And that's also interesting because it tells us that Ubba is the Duke of the Frisians, which might give us some clues as to where some of these liðs, or groups that made up the Great Army, were coming from. So based on the written sources, we seem to have specific terms being used, and they seem to be based on genuine knowledge. And they demonstrate a knowledge of the structure and the hierarchy of the army. So we seem to have kind of first-hand evidence of how the kind of makeup of the army in terms of the leadership. And as I've mentioned, if you disregard the F recension of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the names first appear in 870, 871, and this is no surprise, as that is the first time that Wessex is invaded, and the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Asser's Life of Alfred are both originating out of Wessex. So lots more, they obviously have first-hand information once they get invaded, which they didn't have previously. And they're probably getting this information from the face-to-face meetings that occurred during so-called peace negotiations at the end of each campaigning season, and sometimes also during the campaigning season, where you would get leaders of the Great Army meeting leaders of whichever Anglo-Saxon kingdom they were in, and negotiating a stay, which basically meant the Great Army would stay in the kingdom in a specific place, which would be the winter camp, and they wouldn't come out and attack anyone. And in return for that, the Anglo-Saxons would leave them alone and probably provide them with some food and probably some silver or something. So it's a little bit an early version of the Danegeld idea. And also, they seem to have arranged all these winter camps to be marketplaces, which we will discuss a little bit later. And going back to our St Edmund story, so this one here is a depiction of one of these meetings. In this instance, Ivar sending a messenger off to negotiate with Edmund after he's been defeated. All right, so that's what's happening in England. How about elsewhere in Western Europe during the Viking Age, well, during the 9th century specifically? The Frankish annals for the 9th century do not describe any leaders of Norse armies, and I'm using Norse in the way that people use Viking, so speakers, likely speakers of the Old Norse language in this instance. So they don't use kings to describe the leaders of the armies, even the great big ones that go and besiege Paris and places like that. And also even Rorik, who is a Dane who rules parts of Frisia from the 840s through to the 870s. There's a few breaks in there, but still he's a very successful, long-running ruler, and he's never referred to as being the king of the area that he's in charge of. The only exception that I'm aware of is an annalist writing one of the extensions of the Annals of Fulda, has one instance describing one of Rorik's successors as a Rex in 885. So yeah, in Francia, they do not use the word king to describe the leaders of Norse armies. In the Irish annals of the 9th century, you do get some Norse being described as kings, and I've got the famous quote there about the death of Ivar. However, the kings that they refer to are people who ruled land in Ireland, especially Dublin. So they're more kind of conventional landed kings rather than the leaders of armies who are invading kingdoms and being on campaign all the time. They've kind of got a landed base that they spend a lot of their time in. So yeah, the Irish example is quite close, but not quite the same as what seems to be happening with terminology in England. All right, so forgetting about the terminology now, but staying with our written sources. And the Great Army regularly occupies places associated with royal authority. So places like York, which seems to be more or less the de facto capital of Northumbria, and that's where the Archbishop of York is based, obviously. Also Repton, which I'll be talking about a bit more later, and Reading and Chippenham are both royal estates. So these are existing Anglo-Saxon administrative kind of nodal points in the landscape. So they're the places that they are focusing on when they are wanting to occupy and invade other kingdoms and setting up their winter camps. And these places are important because they're the places that the local tax, which is paid as food at this period, get delivered to. And the Great Army generally have their winter camps just after harvest. So by the time they get to somewhere like Chippenham, it's probably got lots and lots of food that's been stored, that's been delivered recently after harvest by all the farmers of the surrounding hinterland. The other thing about these places is that they are on important transport routes, so where lots of different roads meet, where there's important river crossings. So controlling these places also allows you to control the local area, the hinterland. So very strategic places and presumably well planned when they decided to go to those places. And I would suggest that if you were a local farmer and the Great Army was occupying the royal estate that is closest to you, the leaders of that army would very much look like the people in control, and maybe the leaders would look like kings. Just a quick example of what one of these royal estates looks like. So we're a long way from Norman castles still at this point. But as you can see, there is a ditch around the estate. So presumably That's partly a defensive ditch, and they also think that there was a wooden palisade around this particular example, so another form of protection. And then inside you've got various buildings, including a great hall, building A there, and some of those other buildings presumably is where they were storing some of the food. Another really interesting thing that the Great Army does, and may lead to the use of the term king in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, is that when they have conquered a kingdom, they don't settle down in the kingdom like you might expect and start living there. They instead set up a client king to look after it for them while the Great Army keeps campaigning. So yeah, very different tactic than what other Viking groups are using at the time. And by setting up client kings, of course, the Great Army are becoming over kings. So the leaders of the Great Army are kind of like high kings or over kings, because they have minor kings, Anglo-Saxon ones, underneath them. And there's various reasons why they might have done this, including access to the king's resources, probably especially food. And I'm mentioning food quite a bit because if these armies are thousands of people, then obviously food is going to be a major issue. And yes, I mentioned earlier that this source has some interesting bits of information that could be true. And one of those is, not only does Ivar, as leader of the Great Army, demand that Edmund submits to him and give up Christianity, which is why Edmund refuses and gets martyred, but part of that is that he wants Edmund to become his under-king. So he wants Edmund to become the client king, basically. And he also wants Edmund to share his hereditary wealth with the Great Army. And that hereditary wealth no doubt includes lots of nice, shiny objects that the army would take away and perhaps melt down and turn into jewelry. But it also would include his access to the taxes, so to all the food. So, and again, obviously food is important. So that's a little bit of information from this later source that perhaps could be true, because it does kind of fit well with what we know from other contemporary sources. There's also been suggestions that in these conquered kingdoms, a garrison was left behind, probably very useful for keeping an eye on the client king to make sure he didn't get out of hand. And also that non-combatants may have stayed in the conquered kingdom. So when a winter camp was set up, you would have maybe some Norse speakers from the conquered kingdoms leaving and going to the winter camps for those few months. It also seems, well, I would suggest that the use of client kings means that the Great Army always intended to settle down in England. They weren't just going to campaign forever. And in 874, when Ceolwulf is appointed client king of Mercia, the Chronicle tells us that he agreed to hold the kingdom until the Great Army were ready for it, basically. So they planned on going back to settle, and that of course is what happened 3 years later. And that seems to be a consistent long-term policy, which again shows strong leadership. So by conquering the kingdoms and setting up client kings rather than ruling it directly themselves, the leaders of the Great Army basically became kings in absentia as they continue to campaign. So maybe the Chronicle, Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the writers were aware of this, and that's why they're referring to the leaders of the army as kings. All right, moving into more archaeology now. And As I mentioned, lots of work's been done on the winter camps, which has really revolutionised our understanding of the Great Army in the last probably 12, 13 years, I think. So you can see there, Torksey, Repton, Foremark, they probably, there's a link between those places. Aldwork and East Thurston, possibly, probably. All of those camps have evidence for manufacture and trade. So as I mentioned earlier, part of the peace deals seem to have included the fact that the winter camps could become trade centres while they were in operation. And presumably they're trading with the local Anglo-Saxon community and maybe also with traders from further afield. So yeah, they're not just sitting there sharpening their swords waiting to go on the next campaign. They're trading and they are making things. And all of this means that there must have been rules in place and an authority strong enough to enforce them, especially for trade, because you're not going to go and trade with people if you think you're going to get ripped off and if there's no, clear guidelines and things like that. So again, this is suggesting that there's some kind of strong authority within the Great Army. And in terms of manufacture, one of the things that they are making are imitation coins, which is really interesting. So they're not making their own coins as kings, they are making forgeries of Anglo-Saxon and Frankish coins. And you can see there's a quote there from Cadley and Richards about how the minting of coins displays the aspirations of its leaders and an attempt to establish Viking authority. And at this time, coinage is mostly controlled by kings. There are a few archbishops, including the Archbishop of York, who was minting coins, but it is mostly kings who are minting coins. So in this instance, they're not minting their own coins, but they are still minting coins, again, suggesting strong kind of leadership and authority, etc. There's also been work done on group identification, especially by Ben Raffield, and in that article cited there, where they suggest that each of these liðs, or kind of pirate band, if you will, had a way of distinguishing themselves from others. Maybe the kind of clothes that they're wearing, tattoos, jewelry, teeth filing, various options, haircuts. So what I'm wondering is whether that did exist for each of the liðs that made up the Great Army, but maybe there was also an overall identity for the army itself in that. So you have both levels of identity, if you will, and this could have been facilitated, of course, with the manufacturing at the winter camps. And one of the things they seem to be manufacturing are inset weights and gaming pieces. Obviously, that's not jewelry. You're not going to necessarily see that, but there's very, very common finds, especially with metal detectors. So yeah, they seem to be very widespread. Maybe everyone in the army had some of these weights and gaming pieces. In terms of things that you might wear, it's interesting that strap ends were manufactured at Torksey and Aldwork. So it'd be interesting to know if they were all the same type of strap end. All members of the army wear the same type of strap ends. Also, doors hammers found at Torksey, Foremark and Repton. Maybe that's another form of, another way of identifying yourself as part of a liðs or as part of the Great Army. Yes, all right, moving on. So that's a little bit speculative, that slide. Back to our primary sources briefly, where very interesting entry in 876. I'm kind of moving a bit more into ritual now, as the rituals of kingship. And it tells us that the king made peace, so that's Alfred, made peace with the raiding army, and they swore him oaths on the sacred ring, which earlier they would not do to any nation. So presumably any nation probably means the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. That's the only mention of the sacred ring, so we're really left hanging to know what the sacred ring was. There is a saga mention of a sacred ring, and for that one, it's an arm ring worn by a priest. So something that, you know, would be visible. Then there's also the famous rune ring from Sweden, which you can see has quite a lengthy runic inscription, which details a particular law, like one aspect of the law. And there's quite a lot of debate over the dating of this, but quite possibly 9th or maybe more likely 10th century. But that one, as you can see, it's quite big. So this is not something that you're wearing on your arm and probably wouldn't be very comfortable wearing on your neck. So this is something that would be carried, presumably, as in the photo. So what can we say about the sacred ring that the Great Army was using? Obviously, we don't know if it's a big ring like the one in Sweden or a smaller ring like the one mentioned in the saga, but whatever it is, it appears to have travelled with the army. So it's something that may have been considered important enough that they had to take it with them on campaign. And it's used during an oath-swearing ceremony. So unless we're just trying to fool the Anglo-Saxons and it was just a normal everyday ring that didn't really hold any significance to them, presumably this is something important and it has some kind of ritualistic aspect to it. And although the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that it hadn't been used earlier for, with any other nation, of course, they wouldn't necessarily know because they really only know what's going on in Wessex. So if this was an important sacred object that you use in oath-swearing ceremonies, it's the kind of thing you could imagine being used when they are setting up a new client, for example. So, you know, maybe it had been used before, which is why they were carrying it with them on campaign. And if it was something that you were wearing, like a arm ring or a neck ring, did that mark the wearer out as a kind of special person of authority? Is it something that a king would wear, for example? Or were there priests, pre-Christian pagan priests with the army, and they were the ones who were wearing the ring, like is mentioned in the saga? Unfortunately, we don't know, but it is certainly tantalizing and hinting at some of the kind of rituals that may have been going on with the leaders of the army. All right, I'm going to finish off with a relatively detailed look at what's going on at Repton, because that, in my mind, that is our best evidence for ritual activity that may involve kingship. And just a quick overview, Repton is mentioned as the location of the winter camp of the Great Army in 8734. That is when the Mercian king is exiled, when a client king is appointed, and it's also when the Great Army splits into two different smaller armies. So it's a really pivotal year in the history of the Great Army. And excavations at Repton show that a converted church, which has strong association with the Mercian royal family, which I'll go into more detail about later, that was kind of incorporated into a D-shaped enclosure with a ditch and rampart. And it might be a stronghold associated with the recently found nearby winter camp at Formark, which is only a few kilometres away. The association between Repton and Formark isn't really understood yet. The ditch wasn't in use for very long, and it was filled in, and the area became the site for elite Scandinavian style burial. And relatively recently, we've had some marine corrected radiocarbon dates, which suggest that the Scandinavian burials were taking place between 872 and 885, so quite nicely fitting in with our primary written sources. And here's a great image from, I've got the full reference for the Biddle article at the end, but anyone wanting to read about Repton, that is still the most detailed report of the excavations there. So you can see the church in the centre here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. D-shaped ditch around it, which apparently didn't last long. The river used to go along the white line at the bottom of the ditch. And over here, there was a mass burial, which is very interesting, that we will get to soon. So, starting with the churchyard, there are three certain accompanied kind of culturally Scandinavian burials that were excavated. However, various weapons were found in the churchyard over the centuries before that, so it's quite likely that there were more than three accompanied burials previously. The most dramatic, I guess you could say, of those was of a 35 to 45-year-old male who's buried with a sword and a Thor's hammer and a boar's tusk and lots of other things that I should have in a photo coming up soon. And right next to him, so in the adjoining grave, was a 17 to 20-year-old male with a knife. And both of these people had died from weapon trauma. And often when we're talking about Viking burials, we perhaps aren't cautious enough when using the term warrior. But in this instance, especially with the 35 to 45-year-old male, when you've got weapons in the grave and they've actually died in battle, then I think warrior is a perfectly legitimate description of that person, at least at the end of their life. Doesn't mean that they didn't also do other things apart from fight, of course. And both of these burials that were side by side, they were under one low mound and marked by a grave marker. And the mound was made up of sandstone, including pieces of an Anglo-Saxon cross. And it's been suggested that this cross may have been deliberately broken up to form part of the mound. So obviously interesting ritual and symbolic things going on there if that was the case. And so I would suggest that the 35 to 45-year-old could be the burial of a king or one of the jarls that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions. So grave 511, that is the burial with all the grave goods of the older male. You can see there's the sword down beside his leg, and you may just be able to make out he's got a necklace, part of which is the Thor's hammer. And anyone who is in Derby, highly recommend to pop into the museum because they have some of the finds from Repton there, including some of the grave goods from that particular burial. You can see the Thor's hammer down at the very bottom right. And they also have this reconstruction of what his head and face probably look like. I do find the piercing blue eyes slightly disturbing, but still, I guess it's nice to give a bit of life to the long departed. So as well as some burials in the churchyard, outside the churchyard, but close to it, there was a mass burial, which is, really quite extraordinary. So it was a disused two-room Anglo-Saxon building, possibly a Mercian royal mausoleum, and that was kind of cut down almost to the foundations and turned into a burial mound, 14 by 11 meters square. So we're talking quite a big thing here. So it's a two-room building, but they concentrate the activities in one of those rooms, which they cover with red clay, possibly as some kind of ritual cleansing process, maybe. And they then stack the disarticulated bones of at least 264 people on top of the clay. So that is, a very large number of people are in this burial mound. And originally there seems to have been a central burial that all the other 264 people were kind of arranged around. And the central burial was in either a stone coffin or a kist. And unfortunately that got dismantled in 1686 when a local farm labourer was digging into the mound looking for stones for some kind of building. But there's no reason to think that he's making up the story of the central burial. And the other, he does describe all the bones around the central burial, so it does match with the later excavation. After all of the bodies are arranged, the burial then gets sealed by a stone cairn and covered by a pebble mound, and a stone curb is also added around the mound. And just having a look, so this is what was discovered when the excavation took place. So you can see the building around the outside. All of those bones there are in a room, and they're kind of, some of them are spilling out in the doorway, which leads to the other room that didn't have bones and things in. But wait, there is more. Not only do you have this amazing mass burial, there also seems to be quite a not certain but probable example of human sacrifice. So one corner of the mound, there is a grave with 4 young people arranged in it, and at the foot of the grave there is a sheep's jaw, so possibly also animal sacrifice. And the grave seems to have quite a large grave marker, which probably maybe marked the whole of the burial mound, not just this one particular grave. And there's also 4 other stone pits dug outside the building that became the burial mound that were later filled in, but we're not really sure what these pits were used, but some other kind of ritual activity, presumably. So just looking at the human sacrifice. So as I say, probable human sacrifice. There's no evidence that the hands were tied behind their backs or anything like that, which would make it a bit more certain. But they all just happened to die at the same time. The bodies were nicely arranged rather than just being dumped. You can see, so 1, 2, 3, 4 skulls. There's the sheep's jaw, and here seems to be the base of a grave marker. So we seem to have a case of kind of monumental burial involving monumental rituals. So very time consuming, and it's also currently unique in terms of a mass burial. We do have some execution burials, but nothing quite like this one, especially if the bodies are around a main central burial. Also, I mentioned that the bones were disarticulated, which means that they weren't held together anymore by tendons or anything. So some of these people may have died a long time before, and so they could have been brought long distances for the burial. Presumably they were buried elsewhere, dug up and then reburied in the mass burial mound. The other option would be boiling in order to get disarticulated bones. And in terms of the ritual, we've got so you partially demolish the building, lay down the clay, stack the bones around the central burial, placement of grave goods, a few things like axes and coins and things were found amongst all the bones, probable human sacrifice, erection of a burial marker, and then the creation of a curbed mound. So quite possibly quite a long period of ritual activity, and no doubt much more elaborate rituals going on that we cannot know about now because they don't survive in the archaeological record. And it's been suggested that it is the burial place of a king, and Ivar is the popular suggestion. However, there's all these other kings of the Great Army that are mentioned that we don't actually know what happened to them. Well, Bagseg, we know, died in 871 during the invasion of Wessex. So was he exhumed and taken to be buried at Repton later on? And the other three there, Ubba, Oscatel, and Unund, they just disappear from the record. We have no idea what happens to them. So any of those could perhaps be in that central burial, or maybe it's another king that was operating north of Wessex, and therefore we just don't even know what their name is. So it's a monumental burial site. It's kind of in the center of the kingdom of Mercia. And as I mentioned earlier, it's associated with the Mercian royal family. There were 2 Mercian kings buried at Repton, and also St. Wystan, who the church is named after, who was a Mercian prince, was also buried there. So it's also a site of pilgrimage and things. It is unambiguously culturally Scandinavian in terms of grave goods and a burial mound and things like that. Nothing at all like what Anglo-Saxons are doing at the time, and therefore clearly signalling that a new group was in power. And in terms of the dating, you remember the radiocarbon dates suggested 872 through to 885. There's also some coins which are also kind of mid-870s. So it would seem that the mass burial especially, would either mark the conquest of Mercia in 8734, or maybe the settlement of eastern Mercia in 877. And just to finish off, not too far from Repton is Heathwood. Basically, you've got Heathwood, then you've got the winter camp of Formark, and then you've got Repton. So the winter camp that's been identified is in between these 2 places of Scandinavian burial. So very interesting things happening in that part of the world. And Heathwood is roughly contemporary with Repton. It's the only Viking cremation cemetery in the UK. There are other individual Scandinavian cremation burials known, but not a whole cemetery of them. It's made up of 59 barrows. Some of those have more than one body. Various grave goods, including weapons, have been discovered in the mounds, and they haven't all been fully excavated yet, so maybe one day more will get done and we will discover more. And anyone who has read the Ibn Fadlan's account of a cremation ceremony on the Volga will know that some very elaborate rituals can take place at cremations, as no doubt inhumations as well. But with cremations, they are even harder to discern archaeologically. So maybe this is another site of elite and royal burial, but it's just harder to know if that was the case. And just a quick plan of the site, and the publication there is where that's pretty well the full report for the Heathwood cremation cemetery. So my conclusions, thank you for staying with me for this long, is the Great Army leaders were called kings by contemporaries, as as that's how they appear in the earliest written sources. And these sources also distinguish between kings and jarls. So the people writing the sources seem to have information about the great army, who's in charge, and what the structure of the army is. The army occupied places associated with Anglo-Saxon royal power. They also acted as over-kings over the client kings of conquered territories, which made them kings in absentia. You've got a sacred ring that's possibly connected to kind of kingship rituals and the status of kingship. And finally, you've got at Repton and maybe also Heathwood, you've got elite burials taking place at a site associated with earlier Mercian royal burials. And it's quite likely that at least one of those burials is of a great army leader, one of the people described as a king. And the very last slide is just a list of other sources that haven't already been mentioned that we used. But as I say, there's pages of sources listed in the article itself. And at that point, I will stop talking. And I guess, Andrew, I should stop sharing. Is that correct?
Yeah, you can do. Or you can leave that slide up for a little bit longer. It's up to yourself. If people
All right,
take some
we'll
notes.
leave it there and I will take questions.
Yeah, perfect. And hot off the starting line, we've got Peter, who's asked, well, fascinating talk, Shane, thank you. Do you think these leaders of the Great Army are deliberately emulating Anglo-Saxon kings, or are we seeing the imposition of a new kind of rulership simply described in Anglo-Saxon terms? I suppose the establishment of client kings while continuing a military campaign is quite new.
Yeah, the client kings thing, there's no other Anglo-Saxon group in the 9th century doing that we're aware of, so that does seem to be something unique, adapting to long-term strategies and maybe local conditions. I do think that they are emulating Anglo-Saxon kingship to some extent, especially when they do settle down and they do start, minting coinage and everything, just like Anglo-Saxon kings do. And also, of course, they keep targeting places associated with Anglo-Saxon kingship. So there's a bit of emulation going on, but they're also clearly doing some innovative things as well. So it's kind of a combination of both.
Okay, perfect. I'm sure that there'll be other questions kind of unpicking that a little bit. Shanna's asked, has there been any women found in any of the mass graves to do with the Great Army? Do you think that some of these women, could have been included in these liðs or war bands that you were talking about?
Yeah, the mass burial, I think 18% of the bones that they were able to osteologically sex were female. And I think isotope analysis of at least one of those female skeletons showed that they had come from, I think, the Baltic area. So that does seem to be someone who's come over with the Great Army rather than being a local person who's ended up in the mass burial. Sorry, I'm trying to remember the other part of the question. Oh, whether the women could be part of the liðs.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are actually 3 potential female burials with weapons associated with the Great Army, but none of them are certain. There are certain issues with all 3 of them. It's certainly a possibility, but yeah, it is. I guess it's curious that our written sources don't mention it, because you'd think that the local priests, who are the ones writing the sources, would be a bit amused by fighting women and might mention it. But yeah, it is certainly a possibility in terms of the archaeology. There are some candidates.
Okay, interesting stuff. Claire's asked, the Great Army seems to have had several kings or jarls coming and going. Do you have a view about where they came from for example, Ivar from Ireland, but Uba from Frisia, would they all have originated from somewhere similar?
Yeah, I think Frisia and Ireland would be the two main candidates, and also other, dissatisfied groups coming from the Francia, because I think Francia start getting a bit better in the 860s at combating Viking armies, so maybe going to England seems like a good idea. And also note, I mean, once they're successful, they're probably attracting people from,
Yeah, momentum.
including Scandinavia itself. I mean, the isotope analysis does show that some of these people came from, they had grown up in Scandinavia. It doesn't mean that they weren't living in
Yeah.
Frisia for a decade before coming to England after they, reached puberty. But some of them at least grew up in the kind of Baltic Scandinavian area.
Okay, perfect. A question from Jonathan next. Might the sacred ring referred to in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle have been made as a token of a particular oath or agreement, a token of the army's mutual support or a treaty, perhaps? I recall reading recent scholarship that maintained that the Forza ring might have been analogous to similar rings attached to church doors that were occasionally used to swear oaths. Searching my work in bibliography for a specific reference. But I'm skeptical that the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to a personal item. A larger ring would accommodate more than one individual participant making a gesture affirming an oath. Holding, controlling such a ring might also reinforce kingly authority.
Yeah, it's interesting because the only things we have to go on are the Forza ring and a saga reference to an arm ring.
Yeah.
So either of those is a possibility. And yeah, the Forza ring did used to be on the door of the church at Forza. Whether that's how it started off, of course, we don't know, because it was on the door in the kind of later medieval period, I think, but whether it was always there from its inception, we don't know. Yeah, I guess it depends in terms of, is it practical to carry a big Forza ring type thing around? Well, I guess it's not too difficult, but yeah, unfortunately, we just don't get any information from the Chronicle to give us any indication of what kind of, what the ring looked like, whether the Viking leaders and Alfred were both holding onto the ring at the same
Yeah.
time when they were making these oaths, whether Alfred was also using a Bible for his oaths, perhaps. Yeah, we just really, it's all just speculation at the
Okay.
end of the day.
Yeah. Okay. A question from Fiona next. Thanks, Shane. That was really interesting. Did the army typically have horses, or did they travel everywhere on foot? I seem to remember they took some horses from Edmund, but was that typical?
Yes, that's a really good question. As soon as they arrive in England, pretty well, the first thing they must have done was, overall the local population and get a peace treaty in place with Edmund of East Anglia, and part of that peace treaty was getting horses. So they're using horses right from the very beginning. So presumably they kept using horses. Whether that you also had some people on foot is certainly a possibility. But the other thing that is, I think, maybe underplayed when thinking about the Great Army is that they're also using rivers and around the coast. Like there's a Viking. Well, the Chronicle actually specifically mentions a ship army once or twice,
Okay.
and the ship army of I think 120, I think is the number they use. How accurate that is, of course, we don't know. Get wrecked in a storm off Exeter, which kind of brings to an end their West, particularly because they've lost so many people traveling by land, but also at the same time people traveling by boat, either around the coast or up the rivers. And all of the winter camps are on rivers,
Right.
pretty
Okay.
much.
Yeah, it's pretty revealing. I guess for the market town setup as well, that's handy. I guess the other thing with horses is that if you have horses, you need to feed horses, and fodder is hugely restrictive for military campaigning. So, would that have been too much to consider on top of everything else?
Well, they're also grabbing cattle and keeping those in the winter
Okay,
camp to
okay,
to eat, because one of the things Alfred does later on is kills all the cattle, so they can't do that anymore.
yeah, okay. A question from Matthew. Thanks, Shane. Great paper. I found the idea of kingly objects like the ring interesting. Do we know anything about crowns?
No.
Okay.
Um, yeah, I'm not even sure if there is a. I'm thinking of Scandinavian picture stones, the images on the Isle of Man, on the kind of the runic cross slabs. Um, I don't think any of them show crowns. It doesn't mean they weren't using crowns, of course, but yes, there's no evidence for crowns that I'm aware of.
Okay. Right, well, that's as there was a flurry of questions came in there. We'll give it another couple minutes just to see if there's anyone furiously typing at their keyboards. And right on cue, Neil's jumped in. And Neil's asked, what kind of textual record or archaeological site do you dream might realistically be found to move your studies forward?
Hmm. It'd be great to find the so-called Northern Chronicle, a chronicle that existed in the Kingdom of Northumbria, which is used for a lot of our later sources, but we don't actually have the original
Okay.
source to use. So maybe there was extra information in there that would really help us understand what's going on in that part of the Viking world. In terms of the archaeological record, finding finding another kingly burial, or finding something like the Burqa warrior woman would be obviously very, very exciting. As I mentioned, there are some at Heath Wood. One of the cremations was it was a woman and a unsexed adolescent, or maybe a younger child, I can't remember, with weapons. So that's one of the possible, women buried with weapons. Also at, I think, can't remember, is it Bedale or is it Sandon or Downham? Some burial from the late 19th century. There is a sword, but there's also oval brooches, but it's not sure if the oval brooches are part of the same burial or a separate burial, so it's a bit ambiguous. And then, I think Bedale in Yorkshire, there is a skeleton with oval brooches in situ, which almost certainly means it's a female burial because only women wore oval brooches as far as we're aware, but also with a spear. So that's another
Okay.
possible Scandinavian woman in England buried with weapons.
Okay. Got a question from Sarah. You mentioned Repton is unique. I wondered if the repository of bones is also unique as a burial method. With the discussion we've had about the difficulties of transporting so many living, it also seems striking that they prioritize moving the dead too and in such numbers. Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the options is that this is the dead from a battle, because even though
Oh, we've temporarily lost Shane. He should rejoin in a second. I have to do my party piece while we wait for him. Sorry, folks, if you just bear with us for a second, try and get Shane back. What a cliffhanger to leave us on as well. I think that was probably intentional. Not at all. Not at all, sir. Jonathan, just for while we're waiting, Jonathan's just made the comment that the Repton charnel is a second burial, isn't it? The bones were deposited there at the same time, but it isn't clear that they all died around the same time or in connection with a particular event, which certainly has a different perspective on it. Okay, so that is Shane completely dropped out now. So what we'll do is we'll give him a couple minutes and just see if we can get him back. And if not, we can draw a line under things. And I'm sure that Shane will be available if anyone has any burning questions that they want to ask him via email. Just give him another minute or so. Yeah, Jay, you've got a question about how they knew the children at Repton were sacrifices. I don't know if anyone knows any more specific information about the skeletal remains. Oh, yeah, Shannon's just saying that she could be thinking of the wrong burial, but I think there were cut marks on the bones. And Claire's added that I think Kate Jarman's River Kings might say something about the children burial, so maybe that's something to have a look at, Jay. Okay, folks, we'll give it another minute or so, and if Shane isn't able to reconnect, I'll make his apologies for him. And like I say, I'm sure that you can answer any questions via email if anyone wants to follow up on anything that was discussed tonight. But at least the technical gremlins have hit him at the end of the talk rather than halfway through. Okay, right. I don't think he's going to be able to reconnect, which is a shame. But yeah, definitely a cliffhanger. Oh, Matthew's just added there that there's a site in Sweden too where 4 children were found in a well, and it's been interpreted as a sacrifice. So maybe that's a well, at least there's precedent for that kind of activity then. Okay, folks, what I'll do is I'll draw things to a close. I'm sorry that was a little bit of a cliffhanger or anticlimactic end. And like I say, I'm sure that Shane will answer any questions if you want to drop him an email. Before I bring things to a close, I've just got a couple of very quick announcements. The first is that this was the penultimate in our INS public seminar series. Our final seminar will take place on Wednesday, the 24th of April for more medieval action, and that time it will be courtesy of our colleague Dr. Oisin Plum, who will be presenting his paper, The Northern Isles and Scotland in the Anglo-Saxon Mappa Mundi. And for all news INS, please keep your eyes posted on the website and on our social media pages. But in the meantime, I hope to see you all there later on in the month. And thank you all for attending tonight, and have a very good rest of your evening. Bye for now.